Thank you very much for coming, everybody. And I would like to give floor in the beginning to Nino Evgenidze, who will introduce the whole panel, and then we'll continue. Nino, please.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nino Evgenidze, Executive Director for Economy Policy Research Center. We are one of the organizers with the Stanford University Center for Democracy Development and Rule of Law to organizing a big leadership forum in Tbilisi on a state building and focusing especially for Georgia. In this a conference and leadership forum framework, I'm glad and it was a great honor. Would like to introduce our distinguished professors, Mr. Frэнсис Fukuyama and Eric Jensen, and please welcome to our distinguished professors in our country and ILIA State University especially. Thank you so much. And now I'm giving the word to Iga.
So I would like to thank very much Nino personally and Economic Policy Research Center for organizing this visit of our distinguished guests to Georgia. And I would like to thank the University of the Bank of Georgia for agreeing with the proposal to hold this panel discussion at ILIA State University. I'm very pleased to welcome to ILIA State University two distinguished scholars, Dr. Frэнсис Fukuyama and Professor Eric Jensen. Professor Fukuyama, as you know, is one of the most influential thinkers of contemporary world. His article on the end of history from 1989, followed by his book on the same topic of the same name 3 years after, has created an indispensable reference for political discourse of the last 25 years. But apart from these classical works, both of which have been, by the way, translated into Georgian, he is the author, and I will just name a couple of them, of a seminal work on trust, which is one of the most significant contributions to the vast literature on social capital, of the book on the influence of biotechnological advances on human nature, and just this list gives an impression of the breadth and scope of Mr. Fukuyama as a scholar, who is almost unique in combining political philosophy, social science, and policy studies in his work. In 2012, he published the first volume of his big and great book on the origins of political order, and we who have devoured the book, or at least part of it since it's more than 600 pages, are anxiously awaiting the second volume of this work to appear on the 30th of this month. Professor Jensen is from Stanford University, a lawyer trained in Britain and the United States. He has, for the last 25 years, practiced, written, and taught law and development in about more than a dozen countries. And the book he edited with Thomas Heller, Beyond Common Knowledge, Empirical Approaches to the Rule of Law, is an unavoidable reference for anybody who would like to get to know the question. And this is all the more important in Georgia, where the political and societal debates of the last couple of years have been centered around the controversies over the rule of law. Now, I would like to say a couple of words about the topic of today, which is a sort of continuation of the session of a conference which was also held yesterday and tomorrow about the state building in 21st century. The name of this panel is State Building, Civil Society and Religion. And it has not been selected by chance. Since Mr. Fukuyama's book on state building from 2004, the topic returned to the center of social science and policy discussions, and we know the complexity of the question, not only from our personal experience, citizens of Georgia, but also from his theoretical work as well. And in his last book on the origin of political order, Mr. Fukuyama has offered as a tripartite division between state, rule of law, and accountability. And this tripartite division reminds, at least me, in a certain way, of the three branches of government, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. But what about the sphere outside of state? how the cultural and societal dimensions affect the state-building processes. Introducing civil society and religion should give us the possibility to answer these questions. And the question of religion is not one among many in current Georgian society. As you know, we are experiencing the revival of religion in this country, which is very strong. This revival is very strong, and this revival went hand in hand with the rise of nationalism and has given us the form of religious nationalism. But what is its relation with the state? This is a very complex question. Religious nationalism reached its peak in Georgia as a reaction to the revolutionary nationalism propagated during the last decade, and it has as its aim to change, and which had as its aim to change the understanding of citizenship in Georgia. Whatever its merits and its influence, this type of revolutionary nationalism is finished by now, I could say. But parallel to that, the religious nationalism has been developing, which regards the national identity as inextricably intertwined with religious belonging, and this certainly can and has caused problems for religious minorities. But there is another question looming on the horizon. What is the relationship of this type of nationalism to the state? Does it need state? Does it strengthen or weaken the state? And there is, of course, a question, the answer to which is by no means easy. What is the relationship of this nationalism to the broader context of Orthodox Christianity? This is a question of very large political consequences for this country, take into account that the traditional center of Orthodox Christianity and religiosity is in Russia. The question of civil society is intimately related to the question of statehood. Actually, the concept of civil society has been introduced in modern usage as a correlative concept for the state. And the major question to be asked is the question of values. Can the statehood be sustained with a particular set of values? Birkenförde, a German scholar, famously said that the liberal secular state lives on premises that it cannot guarantee itself. But what is that guarantees the existence of this liberal secular state? I'm sure that our distinguished guests will help us today to better understand these questions. And the third panelist, we will have Professor Levan Gignishvili from ILIA State University, who is himself saying that he's a philologist, but he's basically a theologian. So it will be interesting to have this theological perspective on this question as well. So, Mr. Fukuyama, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here at ILIA State University, and I guess the Bank of Georgia University is also one of the sponsors, so I'd like to thank them as well. And it's a great pleasure to be among students and faculty. I really like academic settings very much. So actually, when Professor Jensen and I discussed a little bit of our division of labor, I thought I would talk about the role of religion and politics, and he would talk more about civil society. So that will explain our particular way of approaching this. So I want to talk about my view of how different religious traditions have influenced the development of modern political institutions. I apologize to my colleagues and people like Gia Nodio who've heard this before, but I need to set the ground in terms of some definitions, because I start in thinking about politics with this tripartite division of institutions in a modern liberal democracy. And so you have the state, which is the monopoly of legitimate force or violence over a particular territory, which is really about the ability of a hierarchical organization to concentrate and use power to enforce rules and set policies and ensure security and the like. The second is the rule of law, which is a set of rules that ideally limit power because they impose rules even on the power holders themselves. And I think in political terms, the rule of law becomes important when it's expressed in things like constitutions that, let's say, divide power or protect individual rights and prevent states from simply acting arbitrarily as they see fit. And then finally, the third set of institutions having to do with democratic accountability, which influence whether the state responds simply to the self-interest of the people that happen to be running the state, the elites that are running the state, or whether it somehow is forced to reflect the interests of the whole population in some way. And the reason we have democratic elections and democratic accountability is as a procedural guarantee of the fact that the government will somehow respect the views of the whole population. And different religious traditions, I think, affect each one of these institutions separately. So in terms of the state, I think that, beginning with the Roman Empire, you've got this long, what Max Weber called Caesaro-Papist tradition, in which there was a single state religion that was pretty much fused with political power, and religion became a source of national identity, and it became a source of legitimacy for the state. And therefore, religion in that respect played a big role in reinforcing state power and giving it a kind of legitimacy that would outlast the particular power holders, because the religious office was fused with the empire. I will remind you that the term Pontifex Maximus, which is now applied to Catholic popes, was originally the title of the seat of the Roman state religion. And when the Catholic Church took over the Roman Empire under the Emperor Constantine, the term Pontifex Maximus simply transferred then to the papacy. And so there's this Caesaro-Papist tradition, and although it is common to say that the Orthodox Church is Caesaro-Papist, there was a long period, a number of centuries, up until really the 11th century, when the Roman Catholic Church was also Caesaro-Papist, meaning that the Emperor Charlemagne, for example, was also the head. I mean, he appointed the Pope, and basically the papacy was subordinate to the Carolingian Empire. And I think that tradition continues in many countries today, this close association of a state religion and state power. And so in that respect, it's a support for state building, but also a support for authoritarianism. Now, the history that I think a lot of people are not aware of, where religion then plays a slightly different role, is in the rise of the rule of law in Europe. And this is a process that I describe in my last book, The Origins of Political Order, where I try to explain why is it that in certain traditions you get a strong rule of law that is able to limit power, secular power holders. And my general argument is that where this exists in that sense, it usually has come out of religion. And so in ancient Israel, in the Christian West, in the Hindu world, and in the Muslim world, in all of those civilizations, you had a source of moral law that was religiously based. It was based on some form of religious scripture. You had a hierarchy of priests and judges who were interpreters of that moral law, and the secular power holders were limited and legitimated by religious authority and by religious law. And that served as one important check on political power. So the caliph and the sultan in early Islam were fused in the same person, but in later periods of Islamic history they were separate, and the caliph could actually act as a certain check on the sultan. It's the clearest in India, where the Brahmins are basically priests who limit the ability of the Raja, or the king, to exercise power. But the separation of church and state actually becomes the most prominent in Western Christendom under the Catholic Church. And this is something that takes place in the 11th century in something called the investiture conflict. Because up until that point, the Holy Roman Emperor had really appointed the Pope. But then you had the rise of a papal party in the 11th century under a reformist Pope, Pope Gregory VII, you had this enormous fight between the papacy and the empire, in which you may remember the Pope excommunicates the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, who has to go barefoot in the snow in Canossa to seek absolution from the Pope. There's a 2-generation-long war, and the war is over the Catholic Church's ability to appoint its own priests and bishops without reference to political authority. And at the Concordat of Worms in the early 12th century, they finally win this right. And this is the origin of the rule of law in Europe. This is the origin of the rule of law in Europe, because the ecclesiastical law of the church is now interpreted by the church itself, separate from secular authority. And I would say if there's anything that is characteristic of Western European political institutions, it is the fact that law is the first of these three institutions that is established, that is clearly established. Law is established before the rise of the modern state, and it's certainly established well before the rise of democracy. And so European state building takes place, Western European state building takes place against the background of a very powerful Catholic Church that is independent in many instances of secular authority and can act as a check on that secular authority. Now, obviously, states in Europe then begin to develop commercial law, various forms of contract law and other things out of the economic necessities of a growing commercial world. But the tradition that law is not the exclusive province of kings is really deeply, deeply established, and it means that in the 17th and 18th centuries, when you have the rise of European absolutism, it takes place against the background of a well-established tradition of rule of law, and limits that rule of law limits the ability of even the most absolutist king to, for example, take the property of elite subjects. So Louis XIV in France could not simply appropriate the property of his elite subjects. And this is one of the big differences, I think, between the Western tradition and the Orthodox tradition that arises in Moscow, because, as you know, the seat of the Roman Empire moves to Constantinople, Byzantium. There's never this kind of split, and the Caesaro-Papist tradition continues in the Orthodox world, with the seat of both political power and religious power remaining the same, and with a very different legal tradition where the Eastern Church does not see itself as a custodian of a law that applies to the emperor, where the emperor is below the law, as in the Western tradition, but in which the emperor is really the one, in a sense, that makes the law and support. I mean, the church and the law become, the church and secular authority become mutually associated. Now, so that's religion and the state, religion and the law. Now, religion and democracy, and this is where I think. Actually, the Protestant Reformation becomes quite important, and this is why I was interested. The rector and I was chairing a panel in which the rector spoke about the rise of religion and religious. I guess he spoke in somewhat concerned terms that the rise of religiosity in a place like contemporary Georgia was worrying from the standpoint of enlightened values and democracy. And I think that very much depends, I think, on the specific religious tradition, because if you look at American democracy, religion has actually been extremely important to the success of American democracy. But I think the reason that that's the case has to do with a specific form of Protestantism that took root in North America. One of the most famous books ever written about American democracy was written by Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French philosopher who traveled to the United States in the 1830s to observe the American prison system. And his one major observation that I think everybody remembers about the United States was what he called the art of association. He said that Americans are very good at organizing themselves at a grassroots level into voluntary associations, that this was important from the standpoint of democracy because it allowed people to group together to make themselves powerful. It was a school for politics that then paved the way for democratic political participation. And if you had gone back to America in the 1830s and said, what were the nature of these voluntary organizations, I would say 80-90% of them would have been religious organizations of one sort or another. But that was very much related to the sectarian nature of American Protestantism, that at this point there was no established Protestant church. The nature of the Protestantism that came from Britain and from the dissenting sects in Germany and Switzerland and places like that were very congregationally organized. There was no single church. It was up to the individual citizens to organize their own churches, to raise money for them. And there's a very powerful theory, there's a theory of secularization that many sociologists held, including Max Weber, that said as we modernize, we're going to stop going to church, we're going to believe in modern science and rationality, and religion is going to disappear. It turns out, as an empirical matter, the only place where this has happened is Western Europe. I mean, the Western Europeans are in fact secular in this sense, but in virtually every other part of the world, there's no correlation between the degree of economic development and the degree of religiosity. And the one country in which this is the most true is the United States. There is no evidence that Americans are less religious today than they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Religion is still extremely important in American life. But this is true in India, this is true in the Middle East, this is true in very many other places. Religion, there is no automatic mechanism by which religion disappears as societies modernize. And one of the arguments about why religion is so strong in the United States is because of its pluralism, that Americans can shop for religion. They're not forced to obey one source of religious authority, and therefore religion continues to act as a vehicle for people's personal choices. They can choose to join a church, they can choose to contribute. It gives them a sense of community, and it's not something that's enforced on them by the state. And this is why I think in the American tradition there has been this very strong linkage between religion and democracy. Now, a lot of you know that in the United States we have all these creationists that are running around saying that you can't teach Charles Darwin and this sort of thing, and that's not a good thing. That's a kind of religious obscurantism that I think is not good for people. But on the other hand, the civil rights movement in the United States was led by Dr. Martin Luther King, who is a Protestant minister. And in fact, to this day, African Americans who participate in, the Democratic Party is now trying to get African Americans to vote in the upcoming midterm elections, and they're going to do that through their churches, because that's really how they're socially organized. That's what allows them to be democratically mobilized to vote in elections and participate in American democracy. And so I think that religion, continues to actually be an important support for democracy, but it's the particular form of religion, I think, that makes a great deal of difference. Now, I have to admit to you that my knowledge of the history of Orthodoxy kind of ends with the Turkish conquest of Constantinople, and I know much less about the way that it evolved, in subsequent centuries, and I know even less about its current manifestations in this part of the world. And so I'm actually eager, so I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm actually eager to learn from you. So thank you very much.
Mr. Jensen, please.
I too am delighted to be at ILIA State University. It's a great delight for both of us to visit and come to a home that Professor Fukuyama and I are very comfortable in, students and faculty. So it's really like a homecoming, even though we've not been here before. I'm going to do four things in my very brief remarks on civil society. First, I'm going to relate some of Professor Fukuyama's theoretical framework of the state democratic accountability and rule of law to civil society. Then I'll look at the different roles of civil society. And I've been asked to explore what is a genuine NGO, what is a genuine civil society actor, and I'll comment on that, and then I'll end with a few comments on civil society in relation to the state. So to take Professor Fukuyama's schematic of the state, democratic accountability, and the rule of law, I think civil society is most known for playing in the space of democratic accountability, of trying to ensure better performance of democratic institutions. And I think that's where many people envision civil society activity. So I would say that civil society both constrains the state to the extent that it associates with making democratic institutions more accountable, and in the space of rule of law. But it also enables the state. In much civil society action, we find partnerships between civil society and the state. And I'm not going to go back into the history of civil society and Habermas and burden you with too much history, but in the U.S., it might surprise you. Professor Fukuyama mentioned de Tocqueville's observation of associational life in the 1830s. Much of that was religious organizations, and even today, the majority of civil society organizations in America are religious. Now, some people do not think of religious organizations as civil society, but I would say in an American conception of civil society, they definitely are. So the roles of civil society, let me break this down in terms of what civil society actors have done in my experience across, 30 or 40 countries. I've lost track. It's all the way from, the high-minded being at the forefront and vanguard of revolution and political reform to building toilets for sanitation. So you see a number of roles of civil society, and I'm just going to tick off a few. One is the sort of collective action and revolutionary role, constraining power, social welfare. You find many NGOs in social welfare, civic education, economic development and legal development, technical support in different reform efforts. There is a phenomenon today of some in the donor community will say we want our program implemented through an NGO. And in that sort of relationship, an NGO is simply a service provider. So what is a genuine NGO? I think there is a perception that the only genuine NGOs are those that are grassroots inspired, and somehow grassroots inspired and voluntary associations at a grassroots level. There's no doubt that those civil society organizations exist and do some remarkable things within communities at a grassroots level. But I would argue that that's not the only genuine NGO, that there are genuine NGOs who are actually working on policy issues and policy advocacy issues at a very high and sometimes very technical level. And I think they are equally genuine. I think where the debate comes is to what extent are these NGOs claiming representativeness? And NGOs who are working at a high policy level may be funded by an international donor for their high-level expertise. If they're claiming representativeness, they'd better watch out. They better test that at least empirically that they are so representative. Grassroots organizations don't have to worry quite so much about the claims of representativeness because they seem more organic and at a community level and do seem representative and very close to the community. So let me distinguish then genuine NGOs from representative NGOs. And I think that the time that NGOs at a policy level and the like get into difficulty is when they claim representativeness and perhaps overclaim membership. Now, finally, let's look at civil society and the state and the role of civil society in the state. And I just thought about this morning, but there are different roles. In periods of transition, civil society actors are frequently at the vanguard of reform and revolution. So they are in opposition to the state in that role, in opposition to the state. They can also be an alternative to the state in providing public services. And most prominently, we see this in the country of Bangladesh, where the state has essentially contracted out its responsibility to provide public services to massive NGOs, Grameen Bank, BRAC, Prashika. They're huge NGOs who are providing essentially state services. So in opposition to the state, they can be an alternative to the state. They can be a social safety net, and in ways providing in gaps where public services do not exist. They can also be in collaboration with the state. In Indonesia, in the Reformasi period, and even today, NGOs are partnering with state entities to push forward reform programs. And these NGOs are providing actually technical services to the state that the state itself doesn't have. So you've got in collaboration with the state as well. And then I would say there are a whole host of NGOs that are out there to somehow enrich in life. And perhaps our next speaker will talk about this in the realm of art and other things that make us what we are as human beings. So just in review of that, NGOs and civil society in opposition to the state, as an alternative to the state, as a social safety net, in collaboration with the state, and to enrich in life. Thank you very much.
And the professor, I think it was John.
It's a great honor for me to be in the same panel with such distinguished guests, and thanks, Giga, for introducing me with the name theologian. In the tradition to which I belong, only three were such: John, Gregory, and Simeon, the new theologian. So I rather choose to be humbler and call myself philologist. But these are very difficult and multifaceted issues, and I don't have really ready-made answers for these complexities. So in Christianity, the secularism was somehow, the germ of secularism probably was seeded in the words of Jesus, saying that give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God. I don't think in any religious text you have similar expression. I mean, in the very holy text, in the very scripture, there was already some distinction between what belongs to divine realm and what belongs to secular realm. Of course, we have far way to go between before John Locke's religious toleration, but there is already something there. It's different fields. And in the first 3 centuries, this field of what belongs to God and does not belong to Caesar provided a certain room of free breathing for Christians, that they would not obey in everything the Caesar. For instance, like Georgia, most popular saint is St. George, yes? And St. George was a Roman officer obeying in everything the Diocletian, but when Diocletian asked him to persecute Christians, he followed the voice of his conscience, and so he did not obey. So there was some kind of room of freedom, not obeying to civic authorities even. So kind of dissent, divinely, how to say, divinely authorized dissent. Yeah, and what about the emancipation of religious conscience from tradition, which became somehow which was an origin of modern Europe? Yes, it's with Martin Luther, and even before Martin Luther, Jan Hus, John Wycliffe. So they were thinking about tradition and their own conscience. So what is tradition? What is the inertia of tradition? And what is their own conscience? And with Luther's famous words that I stand here and I cannot stand not here. So that's his voice. He says that even whatever tradition says, unless it is somehow checked by my own conscience, I cannot follow it. And when there is a clash between the two, I choose my conscience. So that such kind of heroic step was in the birth of New Europe. Next, it was done in philosophy by René Descartes, and that cogito ergo sum. So I don't assume that something exists there. Even God doesn't exist, maybe, but I assume something. So this initial point is in me, not outside me, not in tradition. Now, this Enlightenment tradition, if we think about Georgia, came to Georgia quite late. So we had long Middle Ages. And so first, by the end of 18th century, we had a great figure, a great European figure, Solomon Dodashvili, who translated Immanuel Kant. And his disciple was Nicholas Baratashvili, who thinks or speaks about this European Enlightenment idea. Actually, Nicholas Baratashvili even lost faith. He lost faith, and so he was seeking for value in his own efforts, in his own spiritual experiments, and saying that, I know, I understand. In a tragic voice, he said that, I understand that I'm doing such thing which was never done before me in Georgia. So I'm going to this path which was untrodden before me. Next time, in the 19th century, there was Enlightenment, European Enlightenment movement in Georgia. Before 19th century, actually, the church tradition was not, how to say, critically examined in Georgia. Only in 19th century, Georgians started to critically examine even church tradition, so that like individual conscience started to emancipate from the church tradition. Like ironically, it happened because of Russian church oppression, of Russian imperial oppression of Georgia. Russians' imperialist policy was to whitewash Georgian frescoes, but actually it was not only Georgian frescoes, it was also happening in Russia. It was simply Baroque style substituting ancient Byzantine style in all territory of Russia, and Georgia was one of these territories after 1801. But Georgians took it also as a violation of their own historical identity. There are some kind of even features of saints' faces in the frescoes, for them, was part of their identity, and this was whitewashed. So Georgians started to critically estimate church. So not everything which comes, what happens in the church. When you have this substitution of Georgian liturgies with Russian liturgies, and with an ununderstandable language, you cannot follow it with your heart. That's why Georgians started to criticize church, and somehow the new national movement started in a way among the writers and not among the church leaders. So they started to think about birth of new mentality, new person. Ilia State writes that we should give birth in us of a value. There is no value, how to say, ready-made value outside, which you have to follow, but you have to discover this value in yourself. And you have to discover in your own personal efforts something in you for which it is possible to sacrifice your life. So some absolute value in you, you have to discover yourself. It's not ready-made. It's not somehow prepared for you like this. So you have to do it yourself. You have to do like Byron's Manfred or Byron's personages. So he tried to introduce this dimension in Georgia. He already started to think about the citizen of a Georgian citizen, not as an Orthodox Christian only, but every citizen can be Georgian already without religious, specifically Orthodox religious identity. And he said that new citizenships should rise, should be established on little God in each of us, which is conscience. So that's why he was accused sometimes that he's atheist and substituting God with conscience. But Ilia was not atheist, but he was saying that we have Muslim Georgians, but they are also Georgians. You do not give them these cheap religious brochures to make them Orthodox, because they will just hate your religion and hate this country. So they are also Georgians in the same way as you are, and because they also have conscience. So Ilia started to think about Georgian mentality, Georgianhood, citizenship in terms of conscience, which crisscrosses different religious denominations. Also, before Ilia Čaučovadze and his circle of Tergdaleulni, somehow Orthodox religion was considered as most important in its contents. In the contents of Seven Ecumenical Council, which defines the rule of faith, but it did not treat the question how this contents is absorbed, in freedom or not in freedom. And with Ilia and his circle, they started to think about freedom, free acceptance or non-acceptance. This freedom point in us is very important. So unless it is accepted in freedom, it is not yet a value. Value is created only in freedom, in free choice. That's why when he said that when Christianity came to Georgia in 4th century, he says that Saint Nino took Christianity to Georgia, and she planted the tree of freedom. So freedom became important. This, in Isaiah Berlin's term, it can be called a negative freedom. Yes, somehow freedom from. But this freedom from is important. Unless you have freedom from, then you will never be sure whether your choice was sincere or not. So sincerity in freedom became very important in 19th century, this Enlightenment thought. Ilias' famous words are, and this is Ilias University. Yes? Ilias' famous word is that that a truthful man is not the man who says truth, but truthful man is the one who says sincerely what he believes to be truth. So the sincerity became all important. So what happened? What happened later with communist rule? With communist rule, religious was suppressed. Yes, and so it was stately imposed atheism, and so church suffocated. Churches were destroyed in thousands, and so they were to be a believer at the time was kind of heroism. And when this national movement, emancipation movement started in Georgia, this emancipation movement, this Helsinki group, Zviad Gamsahurdia, the ones who oppose the Soviet state, they're very religious people. Most of them. I don't remember any of them to be irreligious. Sometimes they had an amalgam of different visions. For instance, Kostava and Gamsahurdia, the two leaders, they were both Steinerist and Orthodox, which is contradiction in terms, but still they were such. Giachanturia had some idea about theodemocracy to be established in Georgia. So all were religious. And when Soviet Union collapsed, somehow this religious mentality became, in a way, substitute to this Soviet mentality. And again, it was not quite. Again, it was not quite, how to say, quite profitable, because sometimes this new type of this religious mentality, new type of identity, this ready-made identity, became oppressive also. And the Georgians, there were groups in Georgia oppressing religious minorities. I have only 2 minutes, and there are so many things to say. But anyhow, about today's situation, we need a lot of critical reasoning in church. Sometimes oftentimes Georgian Orthodox take Orthodox tradition as some givenness, which you do not question. So, and I think there is a problem, because Orthodox tradition should be very critical tradition. because Orthodox tradition is tradition of Cappadocians who absorbed Plato and Aristotle, all Greek philosophy into Christian theology. It was very creative thought. And this creative thought continues throughout centuries. You have Dionysius, pseudo-Dionysius Areopagite of 6th century, taking the Platonic ideas into Christian theology. You have Maximus Confessor, great many creative thinkers. Vladimir Solovyov in Russia, who spoke about importance of secular culture, that secular culture also is a milieu of divine revelations and Christians have to absorb it. So that's why in modern Georgia we have a problem that civil society and church went somehow astray, kind of went in different ways, and there is no language of communicating between, and sometimes church looks at secular society as godless and some bad society, and vice versa, secular society looks at the church as some obscurantists. And so there is this bridge is important, and this bridge is to be done, to be kind of laid. But and there are very few priests, I guess, who can do it, and also a few laymen who are eager to do it. So that was all I want to say in this little space of time.
I would like to thank all three presenters for their rich and concise talks. And now I would like to open the floor for questions, please. Gia, please. Yeah.
Okay, I have 1.5 questions to Frank and one to Eric, and to Levan I may ask later because he's here anyway. So Frank, you spoke about roots of rule of law in the West, in autonomy of Catholic Church and its ability to somehow compete with secular power, and which is sort of natural because Church represents God and God can compete with Caesar. So one question is out of this that when one thinks of rule of law and Western civilization together, often what comes to mind is Roman law, which is not of religious origin. How Roman law fits in your scheme. That's one thing, and secondly also, not all countries are Catholic, and we don't have maybe that kind of religious ground for the development of rule of law. So what are alternative ways if you don't have that kind of autonomy of the church which can impose something on the rulers? What can there be as an alternative way? And a shorter question, you spoke about which NGOs are genuine or which maybe not, but somehow you made an assumption that civil society equals more or less NGOs. But that equalization more or less comes from 1990s, and we have quite rich intellectual tradition of what is civil society, where the word NGO was not invented, but also, I mean, the meaning was much broader. So would you somehow elucidate the concept of civil society then? Thanks.
Those are good questions. The Roman law tradition was a very interesting one because there was a high degree of autonomy to law in the Roman Empire, although it was not embodied in it. They had separate jurists, but it wasn't embodied in a clear hierarchy. But the way it plays in the Western European tradition is in that investiture conflict that I mentioned, because one of the things that the Papal Party did was they discovered the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Justinian Code, a copy of it sitting in a library in northern Italy late in the 11th century. And they took it, they translated it from Greek into Latin, and they started to teach this law, this body of Roman law, this highly developed body of Roman law in the first law school in Western Europe, which was the one in Bologna, which then seeded law schools in Krakow and Copenhagen and Oxford and the Sorbonne and other places. And so the revived Roman law, so that Roman law had come from Constantinople, actually. It was compiled under Justinian. And that Roman law, although it came from a Caesaro-Papist jurisdiction, became the way that the Catholic Church exerted its independence from the Holy Roman Empire, because the Church was in effect saying, we are the only legitimate custodians of this Roman law tradition. So that's the way that Roman tradition actually, I think, plays out in Europe. Now, there are many alternatives to religion, so I'm not saying you have to be a Catholic to have rule of law. There's lots of, there's a lot of incentives for, and the economists have come up with, theories about why people should actually want to obey the law. It's rational, particularly in a spreading commercial, industrial society. You need property rights, you need commercial law, you need contract enforcement, and so people simply in their own interest will adopt the law. What I think that this Catholic ecclesiastical tradition does, though, is its impact is not intellectual, its impact is more social and institutional. It creates a tradition of lawyers, of law schools, of independent judges that initially has a religious form, but over time secularizes. But the tradition is still one of independence of jurists. That's what I think is important in that tradition. But countries coming later that don't share in that tradition can also make their judiciaries independent, and they've got a lot of incentives to do so, because now we don't have a universal Catholic Church, we've got a universal human rights community. I actually think that the origin of modern human rights intellectually does come out of Christianity, because the Christian doctrine of the universal dignity of man has simply been secularized and turned into doctrine of the universality of rights. It's just that the human rights community is very confused intellectually, and they don't. If you ask them, well, where do these rights come from? They have no idea. But they just think that but that's really intellectually where it comes from. So there's alternative routes. Eric.
Professor Nodi, I'm going to venture a little bit into Professor Fukuyama's domain and the questions you asked. Islamic law, I was drafted by Stanford to teach Islam and the rule of law right after 9/11. I'm not an Islamic legal scholar, but I am seriously initiated in Islamic law. And that's an important qualification, because I think to be a scholar of Islamic law, you actually need to study it. It's so historically embedded, you need to study it for a decade at least. But I would say that, Islamic law, the reasoning that was developed between the death of the Prophet in the 12th century, the legal reasoning of Islamic law, and I always thought Weber was right on all sorts of things, but I think he was far too dismissive of Islamic law as sort of Qadi justice, as he dismissively called it. The rules of reasoning in Islamic law in that discipline that were developed during that period are very familiar to me as a lawyer. And so I want to broaden it a bit. I think Christianity had a lot to do with rule of law, but there were alternative traditions, yeah. And one of the problems in Islamic law is that there then became a debate about whether the gates to ijtihad closed in the 12th century. That is, the right to interpret Islamic law. And it became a surprisingly robust debate where many voted that, no, by the 12th century we had achieved perfection. And I think history has not been very kind to that view of discontinuing interpretation. On civil society, yes, I admit I bastardized civil society a bit in the discussion on NGOs because it's popular discourse. But the original conceptions of civil society that de Tocqueville explored, that Habermas explored, that Lester Solomon, a former colleague of yours at Johns Hopkins, explored, looking at the associational revolution and all manner of ways in which people associate with each other outside the sphere of the state. And I didn't mean to reduce civil society to NGOs. I mean, there's just so much activity, from butterfly catching to media organizations, to anything that one might be inspired to pursue in associational life that is a part of this vast body of civil society.
Thank you, and thanks to panelists. My question is to Professor Fukuyama concerning Catholicism in Latin America, because if we are talking of about different contexts, intuition tells me that that Catholicism in Latin America might resemble more Orthodox Church in the Eastern Europe rather than Catholicism in Western Europe. So your elaboration would be interesting on that.
Are you going to take more questions, or should I answer that?
Please.
Okay. So in later years, the Catholic Church reunited with the state in particular territories, and this happened in Europe, and you're right that this happened in Latin America. But the fact remains that there was a certain institutional independence of the church, and if you look at the recent history of Latin America, liberation theology comes out of a certain strain of Catholicism. And, you know, this is what supported Marxist guerrilla movements and anti-regime, you know, anti-systemic social movements. The Mexican Revolution in the early 19th century was organized by two dissident Catholic priests. So I think that, you know, even in Latin America, the church has given independent support to opponents of state power, and that remains, you know, so there's clearly an authoritarian side of Catholicism, but also that other side. One other point to make is that within these, so the traditions change all the time. Samuel Huntington, my teacher, wrote this book called The Third Wave, in which he argued that one of the reasons you've had this global third wave of democratization is actually traceable to a change, you know, that came in Vatican II in the 1960s, where the Catholic Church finally reconciled itself to democracy, because in Italy and Spain and other places, up until that point, it had been a pretty firm ally of authoritarian government. And only after the Second Vatican Council, you know, did you get, you know, people like John Paul II and people that were in the Catholic tradition that were clearly supportive of modern democracy. So it's a complicated story.
Well, first of all, thank you for your interesting talk and welcome to Georgia. Now I have a chance to ask you, Mr. Fukuyama, what is the modern Europe for you? Can you tell me? I wonder about your opinion. What is the modern Europe for you?
What is modern Europe?
Yes, what is the modern Europe?
What is modern Europe? Well, that's a good question. The modern Europe that I would like to believe in is the heir of an Enlightenment tradition that is based on a certain belief in, you know, the universality of rights and the political institutions that arise out of it, and that's politically tolerant, you know, that makes room for religion but is not dominated by religion, and so forth. But I think that being said, modern Europe has got a really big problem because it no longer believes in the philosophical and religious bases of its own civilization, and that this is a tremendous problem. And it's also, you know, America is a little bit less like that, but it's got a similar problem. The Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. These are the words of Thomas Jefferson, that comes out of John Locke and a belief in natural rights based on a certain understanding of human nature. Nobody believes this in the United States. I mean, they believe in rights, but they don't believe in that justification for rights. And as I said about modern advocates of human rights in Europe, if you ask them to describe the philosophical basis for why there are universal rights, they'll give you an extremely relativistic kind of answer. They'll say, well, that's what everybody around the world seems to believe in. I had this argument with, what's his name, Schultz, the guy that was the head of Amnesty International for some time, where, you know, I said to him, well, what do you think, where do you think your rights, your human rights that you're defending come from? And that was basically his answer. He had no, you know, he had no solid metaphysical basis for, you know, this whole movement that he represented. So I do think that there's a kind of internal contradiction at the heart of modern Europe that, you know, one worries that because that contradiction exists, it's going to have political effects in terms of the self-confidence and the belief in their own values and institutions that modern Europeans hold.
Good afternoon. My name is Levon Isakhanyan. I would like to ask you, Mr. Fukuyama, about contemporary Georgia and to ask you for a recommendation to the Georgian authorities concerning religious minorities in Georgia. According to the last census, more than 25% of Georgian population belongs to different religious minority groups. And one of the main issues in our political agenda is the discrimination against religious minorities. And this discrimination has different dimensions. Unfortunately, religious minorities, they are, according to international organizations, according to minorities themselves, they are discriminated against in the field of taxation. They are discriminated against in the field of restitution of properties confiscated during the Soviet times. And this last issue has, again, various dimensions, as part of the properties confiscated during the Soviet times from religious minorities was appropriated by the Georgian Orthodox Church, and unfortunately our state, our public officials, they facilitated this appropriation and they even issued property documentation. And we understand that one of the main preconditions of such situation is the strength of the Georgian Orthodox Church. Actually, the Orthodox Church is the most influential institution in contemporary Georgia. So my question is, what would your recommendation be to our authorities? What should our government be doing when it faces challenges or related to discrimination of religious minorities? And second question, as you might know, in Eastern European countries, after the reinstatement of their independence, one of the main issues faced by those countries was the restitution of properties confiscated during the Nazi regime and during the Soviet regime. So what should our government be doing with regard to restitution of property confiscated from religious minorities during the Soviet times? Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to give you a lot of specific advice because I just don't know enough about the situation in contemporary Georgia. I would say the following, that any modern liberal democracy needs to enforce religious tolerance. I think that, you know, some like France and Kemalist Turkey went further than that. They were actually actively anti-clerical. And I don't think that's a good, you know, that's not a good posture either. But, you know, one of the foundations of, you know, of modern liberalism is religious tolerance and equal treatment of religions. Now, the problem is that national identity is frequently built around religion. And, you know, this continues to be an issue even in the European Union, because if you remember a few years ago, in this debate over the European Constitution, a lot of Christian Democrats actually wanted to insert the phrase that Europe was a historically Christian country. And in Italy, they've had these arguments over whether you can display crucifixes in public institutions like hospitals and schools. And of course, I notice in your flag, you know, you've got crosses there. And so there's this, you know, complicated issue of societies that have strong identities that are built around religious traditions that you're not going to eliminate, nor should you necessarily want to, but how do you make that compatible with the demand for even-handed treatment of religious minorities and the like? And that's why I think it's probably better to try to build national identity around other, sources of identity that are more political and are more susceptible or more inclusive of minorities, where people can, participate in the national culture without having to confess, a particular religion. But I think the principle is absolutely clear about what Georgia ought to do. It ought to protect those minorities.
Thank you very much. Thank you for ILIA State University to bring you up all the way here. My question actually to both of you, Eric, Dr. Eric, and to you. Taking from the John Locke to Immanuel Kant, and from him to Woodrow Wilson to the soft power, which is, I'm going to refer from the Joseph Nye, which is, you may know him, and taking the hard power and soft power would give birth to genuine power today. So for the NGO, yes, is alternative state, but some countries, the NGO, which is being global power, is kind of like considered the parallel to the state. Like it kicks back. We have an example in Turkey today. One of the global NGO is like a state kind of taken hard on it, not to think, okay, this is alternative. At the same time, this is parallel. So we had the World War I and World War II war, and there was enormous hope we will not gain it. So how do you think that effective NGO today and civil society and also the soft power is effective to avoid the common, or maybe not possibly, hopefully not, the next such atrocity in the world that can cause the wreak havoc or chaotic crisis? Thank you.
Well, I'm actually a little bit skeptical about some of our emphasis on the NGO sector and, what we identify maybe incorrectly as civil society, because there are a lot of problems with this sector. Professor Jensen and I were talking about this earlier. There's a big problem of legitimacy with many NGOs and civil society organizations. They purport to represent the environment, women, labor, various high-minded causes, but are they actually accountable to the people they claim to represent? Because there is no formal mechanism for most of them by which this happens. And in fact, there is a big internal grassroots revolt in the Sierra Club against its own leadership, because a lot of people felt that leadership was just serving its own interests and not the interests of the environment, or at least what, the way that the rank and file membership interpreted that. And furthermore, this is a particular beef of mine, I do not think you can govern modern societies from civil society. I mean, it's true, as Eric said, that in some societies, NGOs become an alternative to government or a parallel delivery system, but because they're not clearly accountable, that is not necessarily a good thing. And the Gulenist movement, I assume you're referring to the Gulenist movement in, Turkey. That's become a state within a state. That's the very bad thing in a democracy, for any number of reasons. And so I think that, yes, a democracy needs a healthy civil society sector, but it also needs to be governed through clear, formal mechanisms of accountability in which civil society needs to give way to other more traditional organizations like political parties and media and other instruments by which genuine democratic accountability can happen.
Just to supplement, and I agree strongly with everything that Professor Fukuyama just said. I've lived through this debate for about 30 years, and I've been on both ends of the spectrum. Where in one case I was at the vanguard of trying to protect civil society activity in Pakistan, a very closed political environment and a very threatening political environment. But I've also been on the other end, saying, look, who do you represent? And I've had many debates with different NGOs who say, oh, we represent this person, that person, and the others. Give me proof of your constituency. I have no proof of this. And we also know about the proliferation of fake NGOs that are set up as sort of fencing operations or fronts for other activity. They don't really represent civil activity. They represent sort of extractive activity with the front of an NGO. So I think one has to be very realistic about this and take each case on its own merit. I'm not ideological about it. I'm actually very pragmatic. When I have discussions with NGOs, I simply want to know what where they, if they claim to draw their legitimacy from some place, then I'm very interested in where they claim it. Now, that's not to say, I was talking about policy NGOs too. Their legitimacy is sort of in the rigor of the work that they do. And I'd be very surprised if, a policy NGO said, well, we represent large swaths of society. That's not what Nino does. She works on policy issues, and that's a very, genuine sort of activity in civil society, but Nino's not going to claim to represent wide swaths of Georgia through the NGO that she represents.
Thank you. But for the Mr. Fukuyama referred to Gulen movement. I mean, that was the great one of the 40 years, building bridges, between Turkey and Europe for the democratization process. And when the government has some dirty issues come out, like bribe and scandal and corruption, so they kind of kick the NGOs, so they kind of make an scapegoat. So that's actually check and balance in the civil society. It's kind of like problem when the state get, around is a purge going on, so these things. So I'm not, for that, 40 years it's been under synchronized, so the Gulen movement is great, which is, Western, kind of opened the door to the Islamic world, to the Western, and one of the, the global humanitarian aid, schools, education, and civil society. So those good examples, definitely yes. But yes, you said definitely it goes through. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Hamas has a civil society activity. So let's, we need to parse. Sorry? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much to all the speakers for your very interesting opening remarks. Mr. Fukuyama, I want to thank you personally. I work for the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy. I wrote you a few months ago asking your permission to translate your end of history article, which I did. The book is coming out in a few weeks. Unfortunately, we couldn't make it for today. But I'll go to my question now. I'll read the title of the panel and the session. And in the 20th century, the modern state was an equivalent of a democratic state. But today, it is clearly not so. And we see democracy challenged from many different fronts, from different economically successful models. You take, the Chinese, the Lee Kuan Yew model, and the ideas of sovereign democracy, this whole Putin things, and so on and so forth. But the particularly interesting challenge, at least to me and to the work I do in Georgia and the Caucasus, is the challenge that comes from the pro-democracy movements and the schools of thought, and namely this whole idea of a liquid democracy, which criticizes democracy from the perspective of it being a little bit outmoded, its representation, its term limits, and especially in light of ongoing technological innovation or revolution, which gives people direct access to information and an ability to interact directly with decision makers. And you also see a number of big cities, even big, especially new political parties, opening up to this new opportunities. My question is, do you see this current of thought as an influential one that can really transform the way the representative democracy works today? And do you see a need for the reform of representative democracy in general? And the question is to you, Mr. Fukuyama, but also to other speakers as well.
So I think that technology has really changed things a great deal in terms of the availability of information, in terms of the speed with which we can know what people want and the responsiveness, the potential responsiveness. But I think, and so, there's many moves afoot, to increase participation and transparency of governments. I think that's by and large a good thing. However, I'm a little bit skeptical that this is actually necessarily going to produce better results for a couple of very simple reasons that I just think have to do with human nature. That although total participation by citizens is an ideal of democracy, in practice it doesn't work, because most people are just not that interested. In California, we have a referendum system in which every year California voters are given a book that's about the size of a telephone book of very complex policy issues that they are required to individually vote on. And of course, people are not well enough informed, despite the plenitude of information they have. This whole process is dominated by well-funded interest groups that can manipulate through TV and other things like that. And as a result, it's just as corrupt a form of politics as the old politics. The other thing that I guess bugs me a little bit is this demand for infinite transparency, because I think actually there are limits to transparency. One thing that's happened in the U.S. Congress is that no one deliberates anymore because everything is on television. And so no legislator ever talks to another legislator. They only talk to activist audiences out there, in TV land somewhere. And the result is the quality of deliberation in Congress is awful right now. And so I think that some of these changes that promise greater information, greater responsiveness, greater participation are attractive ideas, and in some cases they can be implemented properly, but in other cases it's actually, I think, led to a deterioration in the quality of democracy. And if this is the wave of the future, I'm not so sure, that's a great thing.
Just taking a lawyer's perspective on this, some of the Professor Fukuyama and I were at a dinner a couple of years ago with a former senator who we asked, when did partisanship really start in the U.S. Congress? And what did you say, Frank? Something like 1970 something, when C-SPAN came into to Congress, we started to negotiate less and less, which is at the heart of politics. You have to be able to negotiate. And who negotiates by giving their whole hand at the beginning of a negotiation? That doesn't happen. So we